Good morning. As we continue our journey through 2 Chronicles today, with chapters 23 and 24 we look at, but at the end of chapter 22, kind of briefly touched that yesterday, King Ahaziah was killed. And, verse 9 says, the house of Ahaziah had no one able to rule the kingdom. So his mother, Athaliah, assumes control. And she says that she saw that her son was dead. She set about to destroy all the royal family of Judah. Anyone else who would have a claim to the throne. But there was one person who stole away a son, took Joash, son of Ahaziah, and stole him away along with his nurse and hid him in the temple of the Lord, in the house of God. And so, when you read, he was hidden away with his nurse, we assume that he's quite young. And we're going to find out that he was. And he was hidden for 6 years. And now we begin chapter 23 with, in the 7th year of Athaliah's reign, this, Azariah's mother, so she's reigning as queen, more or less, a priest, Jehoiada, takes courage, it says, and calls together the commanders of several groups of 100 troops, calls them together and brings them to the temple. And they named them, and they went throughout Judah, gathering Levites from the towns and heads of family, and they came to Jerusalem. The whole assembly, it says, makes a covenant with the king. Well, where does this word king all of a sudden come in? Because Athaliah is in charge. And so who is this king? Well, it's none other than Joash, this infant who was hidden away for 6 years. And we don't learn until the beginning of chapter 24 that he was 7 years old when he becomes king. So, how much management, a 7-year-old is just not capable. We know that. But, so it says, made a covenant with the king in the house of God. Jehoiada said, here is the king's son. Let him reign as the Lord promised concerning the son of David. And then he gives the priests, a third of them this, a third of them that, and a third of them that. And the rest of you. When you divide out 3/3, they're all taken care of. But they are to serve in the house. They are to protect and, they, not to let anyone enter the temple here other than they're supposed to be. And they have weapons in their hands, these Levites, these priests, and it just doesn't, but there were weapons in the temple, in the house of God that, that had been made for that purpose, by David and by Solomon. So they did, these priests and Levites did all that the priest Jehoiada commanded. They brought their men and they established a king. It says, verse 11, he brought out the king's son, put the crown on him, gave him the covenant, and they proclaimed him king. And Jehoiada and his sons anointed him as they shouted, long live the king. And with all of this commotion now then, Athaliah, Athaliah would actually be Joash's grandmother because she was the mother of his father Azariah. She hears the commotion and she comes and what's going on? Her authority is being undermined. And who is this young upstart? Where did he come from? She doesn't know a thing about this Joash. But they have installed him as king. It says that she tears her clothes and cries out, treason, treason. But the captain of the guards arrest her. And the priest Jehoiada says, we can't don't kill her here in the temple. They took her outside and she was then put to death. She had not been a good ruler, a good leader, faithful to God. And, but they took her out and there they put her to death. And then verse 16, Jehoiada made a covenant between himself, the people, and the king, that they should be the Lord's people. And a covenant isn't a word that we use very often today, but it's a promise. It's a legal and binding contract. We'll sign an agreement, a purchase agreement. We don't really shake hands on too much anymore. I mean, that's a handshake used to be pretty much a guarantee, but but in today's world, I mean, so many of the covenants, so many of the contracts we sign are too easy to get out of. And here, this covenant that Jehoiada makes himself and the people and the king, they make a covenant, a promise that they will be the Lord's people. And we know how that always works. I mean, but Joash, under Jehoiada's guidance, I mean, the 7-year-old boy, under the guidance of Jehoiada, does rule fairly. I mean, his reign ends up being 40 years, but before his reign is over, other things happen. But the gatekeepers were established so that nobody unclean would enter. I mean, they got back to worshiping God and living as the people of God. So chapter 24, Joash was 7 when he began to reign. He reigned 40 years, and his mother was Zibiah. I mean, his grandmother was Athaliah. I mentioned that already. But Joash did what was right in the sight of the Lord all the days of the priest Jehoiada. And he had wives and sons and daughters, and he began to restore the house of the Lord, and he started gathering the taxes, the levies that had been supposedly to be paid, and started giving them then to the priests. But the priests didn't begin to act right away on it. And so then Joash summons Jehoiada, the chief priest, and asks him, well, why haven't you started yet? And, he's wondering that. And then verse 7 is just a kind of a flashback. The children of Athaliah, that wicked woman, had broken into the house and used all the dedicated items and the items of worship to worship the false god Baal. So the king made a command and set up a chest, and the people came and paid their taxes, their levies, and construction on the temple began. And it was rebuilt to the original specifications, fortified, reinforced, made stronger, and they just continued to do as they were supposed to, and continued to follow God in all of those things. Verse 12 says, the king and Jehoiada gave the money to those who had charge of the work, and they hired masons, carpenters to restore the house of the Lord. And then verse 15, we have kind of a switching again. Jehoiada grew old and full of days, and he died. He was 130 at the age of his death. So you think about, if he's 130 when he died, and Joash ruled 40 years, I mean, he was at least 90. I mean, because Joash's reign doesn't end right now either. But he was quite an old man when he called everyone together and says, we're going to worship God. And, he was one of the elders, and people listened. And so often in today's world, we kind of forget that our elders, we can learn some things from them. Not always, but a good share of the time. They've been through things, they've experienced things, and we need to pay attention. So verse 17, the death of Jehoiada. The officials of Judah came and did obeisance to the king. They abandoned the house of the Lord. Boom. They don't have this strong and faithful leader, and they fall apart. It's just, and sometimes, I read this and I wonder, well, how can it fall apart so quickly when one person dies, But, that person has been the glue that's held everything together. And we see that in families. We see that in churches. We see that in so many things that, you've got someone who is a strong leader. And if and when that strong leader moves away, dies, whatever happens, the infrastructure that was created can fail. And again, here in Jerusalem, that's what happened. things they were falling away from God. And verse 20, the Spirit of God took possession of Zechariah, and this is a different Zechariah than John the Baptist's dad or anything, but he prophesies. They don't like his prophecy, so what do? They kill him too. They don't like to be reminded of their falling away from God. And, I guess we're not a whole lot different. We don't like to have our faults and our failures pointed out to us either. But the continuing saga goes on with the faithful leaders and unfaithful leaders and all of the stuff that goes on within the world. It hasn't changed a whole lot from all those years ago until today either.